There were moments when the geography of belonging became painfully visible, when spaces divided themselves according to invisible rules that separated the chosen from the forgotten, the valued from the overlooked, the destined from those who learned to find comfort in shadows where expectations couldn't reach to disappoint or wound. For Irina Silverwind, that moment of absolute clarity came every year during the selection ceremony, when she faced the choice between claiming space she didn't deserve and accepting invisibility that felt safer than risking rejection in front of witnesses whose opinions could reshape her understanding of her own worth. 23 years old and bearing the quiet dignity that came from learning to navigate life without the advantages that others took for granted, she possessed the kind of understated grace that emerged from understanding that survival sometimes required making yourself small enough to avoid notice from those whose attention might prove dangerous rather than beneficial. But grace earned through systematic invisibility was often mistaken for insignificance by those who had never been forced to measure their worth according to other people's willingness to acknowledge their existence. The selection ceremony was supposed to represent hope incarnate, an annual gathering where unmated wolves might find partners whose compatibility transcended conscious choice, where divine will expressed itself through recognition that created bonds blessed by forces older than political calculation or social convenience. The Great Hall would fill with possibility and anticipation, with families whose strategies had been carefully planned to maximize their children's chances for advantageous partnerships that could elevate their social position while serving the greater good of pack prosperity and territorial security. For most participants, the ceremony represented destiny waiting to be claimed through courage and appropriate presentation, through confidence that announced worthiness for consideration, by those whose choices would determine romantic futures according to principles that supposedly honored divine guidance, while serving practical purposes that strengthened community bonds and political alliances. For Irina, it represented an exercise in endurance, hours of sitting quietly, while others discovered happiness that seemed to exist in realms beyond her reach, watching bonds form that reminded her of connections she had never experienced, despite years of hoping that someday someone might see past surface characteristics that failed to meet conventional standards for omega attractiveness and desirability. She had no family presence to recommend her to prospective partners, no bloodline that carried prestige or political connections that might compensate for personal qualities that had never attracted the kind of favorable attention that translated into romantic interest. Her parents had died when she was young enough that their faces existed more in imagination than memory, leaving her to be raised by pack charity that made her continued existence conditional on gratitude and invisible behavior that avoided inconveniencing those generous enough to provide basic necessities. The position she had chosen for this year's ceremony, an empty seat along the outer wall where shadows gathered to offer refuge for those who understood their place in social hierarchies that operated according to rules they could observe but never influence, reflected acceptance that had been earned through years of learning that hope often proved more painful than resignation when applied to situations beyond individual control or modification. From that vantage point, she could observe without participating, could witness the magic that transformed other lives, while maintaining enough emotional distance to protect herself from the kind of disappointment that accumulated when expectations exceeded realistic assessment of personal prospects for romantic recognition. But sometimes, when resignation seemed most appropriate and invisibility appeared most wise, the world revealed truths that challenged every assumption about destiny and recognition, about who deserved attention and who had been overlooked despite possessing worth that transcended conventional understanding of value and compatibility. Sometimes, when solitude felt safest and isolation seemed most protective, forces beyond social calculation intervened to demonstrate that divine will operated according to principles deeper than pack politics, that recognition could emerge from unexpected directions to honor qualities that others had been too limited to see or appreciate. Sometimes, the empty seats along the edges held more truth than the privileged positions at the center, and those who chose invisibility discovered that destiny had been waiting not for them to announce their worthiness, but for someone wise enough to recognize what had been hidden in plain sight by assumptions that confused surface characteristics with underlying value. Tonight would determine whether Irina's careful invisibility would protect her from disappointment one more time, or whether the quiet dignity that had sustained her through years of systematic oversight would finally attract attention from someone whose recognition could transform her understanding of her own worth and future possibilities. The ceremony awaited, patient and full of promise for some, resignation for others, and occasional miracles for those whose worth had been waiting centuries for appropriate acknowledgement from hearts wise enough to see beyond conventional expectations to divine truth that challenged everyone's comfortable assumptions about love, recognition, and the mysterious ways that destiny revealed itself to those brave enough to claim what had always belonged to them. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The Grand Hall of the Moonstone Palace had been transformed for the selection ceremony into something that resembled a theater of dreams, where every architectural detail had been designed to emphasize both the sacred nature of the proceedings and the hierarchical structures that governed who belonged where during events that would determine romantic futures, according to principles that supposedly honored divine will, while serving practical purposes of social organization. Massive columns of white marble supported ceilings that soared toward stained glass windows, depicting the moon goddess blessing unions that had shaped their kingdom's history, while crystal chandeliers cast dancing patterns of light that made everything feel charged with possibility and ancient magic. The floor itself had been arranged in concentric circles that radiated outward from a central dais, with seating assignments that reflected family prominence, territorial influence, and social connections that could affect political relationships for generations. Irina arrived early, before the hall filled with families whose strategies had been carefully planned to maximize their children's chances for advantageous partnerships, before the whispered conversations about bloodlines and political advantages began creating the competitive atmosphere that transformed sacred ceremonies into exercises in social advancement and calculated alliance formation. She moved along the periphery with practiced invisibility, seeking the empty seat she had identified during previous years' ceremonies, positioned against the outer wall, where shadows gathered to provide refuge for those who understood their place in hierarchies that valued contribution over bloodline, but still operated according to rules that prioritize conventional markers of success and desirability. The seat she chose was comfortable enough despite its marginal location, offering clear views of proceedings while maintaining enough distance to allow observation without participation, witnessing without the vulnerability that came from hoping for recognition that history suggested was unlikely to materialize regardless of personal merit or hidden qualities that remained unrecognized by those whose attention she had never attracted. As the hall began filling with participants whose presence announced their confidence about belonging in spaces designed for those who expected favorable outcomes, Irina settled into her chosen position with the kind of resigned acceptance that had sustained her through years of similar gatherings, where her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, endured rather than celebrated. The families that entered moved with choreographed precision that spoke of generational experience, navigating ceremonies where presentation could determine life-altering outcomes, where every detail from clothing to positioning carried significance that educated observers would recognize and interpret according to complex social codes that governed pack politics and territorial relationships. Lady Seraphina Nightfall arrived wearing robes that shimmered with embroidery that announced her family's ancient lineage, while jewelry that had been passed down through generations of successful political alliances caught light in patterns designed to attract attention from those whose choices could elevate her social position through advantageous partnership formation. Behind her followed other young women, whose preparation had involved months of coaching by mothers and aunts who possessed hard-won knowledge about navigating ceremonies where beauty, bloodline, and political connections would be evaluated by potential partners whose selections would determine not just romantic futures, but family prosperity and territorial influence. Even from her peripheral position, Irina could see the confidence that marked those who expected favorable outcomes, could observe the careful positioning that maximized visibility while demonstrating appropriate deference to hierarchies that governed ceremonial proceedings. Every gesture had been practiced. Every expression had been calculated to convey the kind of attractive availability that might catch attention from alphas, whose choices would be influenced by political considerations as much as personal attraction. "Attention, honored guests," announced the master of ceremonies, his voice carrying across the hall with authority that commanded immediate silence from conversations that had been building anticipatory energy throughout the space. "We gather tonight under the sacred moon to witness bonds that will strengthen our kingdom through partnerships blessed by divine will and guided by wisdom that transcends individual preference." The traditional invocation that opened every selection ceremony words that had been spoken for generations to honor both the spiritual significance of what they were witnessing and the practical purposes that such unions served in maintaining territorial stability and political relationships that affected thousands of lives beyond the immediate participants. Let those who seek partnership approach with hearts open to recognition that may come from unexpected sources, the master continued, his ceremonial robes catching light from chandeliers that had been positioned to emphasize the sacred nature of proceedings that claimed divine authority for choices that often reflected social calculation more than spiritual guidance. Around the hall, unmated alphas began taking their assigned positions, according to protocols that had been established through centuries of similar ceremonies, their placement reflecting family prominence and personal achievements that qualified them for consideration by potential partners, whose own value had been assessed according to comparable criteria. At the center of their formation stood those whose bloodlines connected them directly to royal authority, cousins and distant relations whose genetic heritage linked them to power structures that governed their entire kingdom. Their presence commanded attention even from families whose own social positions were secure. Recognition that partnerships with royal connections could elevate ordinary territorial influence to unprecedented levels of political significance. But as impressive as these royal relations appeared, everyone present understood that the true focus of anticipation remained fixed on the entrance that had not yet been graced by the presence they were all expecting. The heir whose choices would determine not just his personal romantic future, but succession patterns that would affect their kingdom's governance for decades to come. Prince Kaelin Ravenheart, heir to the Alpha King's throne and ultimate authority throughout territories that spanned continents, possessed the kind of legendary status that made his attendance at local ceremonies feel like divine blessing bestowed upon their pack through royal favor that exceeded normal territorial relationships. Stories about his capabilities had reached mythical proportions among those who had never encountered him personally, accounts of strategic brilliance that had resolved territorial disputes through diplomacy rather than warfare, physical prowess that exceeded even genetically gifted royal bloodlines, leadership qualities that inspired absolute loyalty from those fortunate enough to serve under his command. But beyond admiration for his achievements, every unmated Omega in the hall harbored private hopes about attracting attention that could transform their lives through partnership with power that operated beyond ordinary pack politics to influence kingdom-wide policies and international relationships that affected millions of lives. As the ceremony proceeded through traditional protocols that honored divine guidance while serving practical purposes of social organization, Irina found herself grateful for her peripheral position that allowed observation without the stress that came from hoping for recognition that statistical probability suggested would be directed elsewhere. From her chosen seat, she could watch bonds form between families whose compatibility had been determined through months of careful negotiation, could witness the magic that transformed strategic partnerships into romantic connections that would hopefully develop into genuine affection over time. The process was beautiful in its own way, despite being driven more by political calculation than spiritual recognition. Young wolves discovering that arranged compatibility could evolve into something resembling love, when both parties approached their circumstances with determination to make successful partnerships from foundations that prioritized mutual benefit over immediate emotional attractee. On His Royal Highness, Prince Kaelin Ravenheart, heir to the Moonstone Throne, the Master of Ceremonies announced with reverence that commanded absolute silence from conversations that had been maintaining steady murmur throughout the hall. The great doors swung open with ceremony that befitted royal presence, revealing the figure whose reputation had preceded him like storm clouds gathering on distant horizons, accounts of power and capability that had created expectations so elevated that reality seemed unlikely to match imagination, regardless of actual achievement or personal characteristics. But when Prince Kaelin stepped into the hall, Irina understood immediately that stories had failed to capture the full magnitude of presence that commanded attention, not through conscious effort, but through inherent authority that made even the vast ceremonial space seem suddenly inadequate to contain forces that operated according to principles transcending ordinary understanding. Tall and powerfully built, with dark hair that caught light from crystal chandeliers and golden eyes that seemed to assess everything while revealing nothing of his thoughts or reactions, he possessed the kind of natural magnetism that made observation feel both compulsive and somehow inappropriate, as if witnessing such concentrated authority required permission that had never been granted. But more than physical impressiveness, it was the sense of absolute confidence that emanated from him like heat from forge, not arrogance or conscious display of superiority, but simple awareness of capabilities that had been tested under circumstances that proved his worthiness for responsibilities that would eventually reshape their entire kingdom, according to his vision and leadership. Around the hall, every conversation stopped, as attention focused entirely on royal presence that commanded acknowledgement without requiring any announcement of its significance or importance to proceedings that had suddenly been elevated beyond routine ceremony to historic occasion that would be remembered for generations. Prince Kaelin moved through the space with predatory grace that spoke of physical training combined with inherited attributes that exceeded normal genetic expression, each step measured and deliberate, despite appearing casual to observers who lacked experience reading movement that reflected both conscious control and instinctive confidence. Every unmated Omega in the hall leaned forward with anticipation that spoke of hopes suddenly ignited by proximity to possibilities that exceeded their most ambitious dreams, while family representatives calculated advantages that partnership with royal authority could provide for territorial influence and political positioning. As he surveyed available options with attention that seemed both comprehensive and somehow detached, Irina felt grateful again for her peripheral position that kept her outside the sphere of consideration, where rejection might prove more painful than the comfortable invisibility she had learned to treasure. But then, inexplicably, his golden gaze found hers across the vast space that separated her marginal position from the central areas where eligible participants had been arranged, according to social prominence and family connections. For one breathless moment, their eyes met with recognition that felt both immediate and somehow inevitable, connection that challenged her understanding of her own worth, while suggesting possibilities that exceeded everything she had ever dared to hope for during years of careful resignation. And then, while everyone watched in stunned silence, Prince Kaelin began walking toward her position along the outer wall, where shadows had been meant to provide refuge for those who understood their place in hierarchies that operated according to rules they could observe but never influence. He was coming toward her. The silence that descended upon the grand hall was so profound that Irina could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears like thunder announcing an approaching storm. Every eye in the vast ceremonial space had turned to track Prince Kaelin's movement as he walked with measured steps away from the central dais, where tradition demanded royal attention should focus, away from the carefully arranged displays of eligible partners whose families had invested months in preparation for this exact opportunity. He was walking toward the margins, toward her. Each step he took seemed to stretch time beyond normal measurement, creating moments that felt suspended between reality and possibility while everyone present struggled to process what they were witnessing. The heir to the throne, whose choices would determine succession patterns and political alliances that affected their entire kingdom, was deliberately ignoring conventional expectations to approach someone whose presence had been designed to remain invisible. Irina's hands trembled in her lap as she fought the instinct to look around for someone else who might be the actual target of royal attention. Some eligible Omega whose family prominence had earned them seating along the outer wall for strategic reasons that her limited understanding of court politics had failed to recognize. But the peripheral areas contained only those like herself, wolves whose social positions made them observers rather than participants, whose presence was tolerated rather than celebrated, whose romantic prospects had been assessed as insufficient to justify positioning in areas where favorable outcomes might realistically be expected. "Your Highness," whispered Lady Seraphina from her prominent position near the ceremonial center, her voice carrying just enough volume to remind royal attention of options that possessed appropriate bloodlines and political connections, partnerships that would strengthen the kingdom through alliances that served purposes beyond mere personal attraction. But Prince Kaelin continued his approach without acknowledgement, his golden eyes never leaving Irina's face, despite the dozens of other options that represented everything Pack tradition valued in potential royal partners: beauty that had been cultivated through generations of careful breeding, intelligence that had been refined through education and diplomatic protocols, connections that could provide advantages in territorial negotiations and international relationships. When he finally reached her position along the outer wall, stopping mere feet from where she sat with the kind of stunned immobility that came from witnessing impossibility unfold in real time, Irina could smell his scent, pine and mountain air mixed with something deeper, more complex, that spoke of power and protection in equal measure while making her wolf stir with recognition that bypassed Anxious thought. "May I?" he asked quietly, gesturing toward the empty seat beside hers with courtesy that transformed request into honor rather than simple politeness, acknowledgement that her permission mattered, despite the vast difference in their respective social positions and political influence. "Your Highness, she began, then stopped as words failed beneath the weight of circumstances that challenged every assumption she had made about her own worth and the likelihood of royal attention ever focusing on someone in her position within pack hierarchies that operated according to rules she had learned to accept as permanent rather than subject to divine intervention. "Irina," he said softly, and hearing her name spoken in his voice created sensations she had never experienced before, recognition that felt both foreign and somehow inevitable, as if he had been calling her name across vast distances, and she was only now close enough to hear properly. The fact that he knew her name at all sent ripples of shock through the assembled observers, suggesting research that exceeded casual awareness to indicate interest that had been developing beyond public observation, preparation that implied intention rather than spontaneous choice made during ceremonial proceedings. "You know who I am?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe that royal attention had been focused on her existence long enough to acquire personal information that should have remained invisible to someone whose responsibilities encompassed entire kingdoms rather than individual pack members of no particular significance. "I know who you are," he confirmed, settling into the seat beside hers, with movements that radiated controlled strength, while his proximity made her acutely aware of size and power that could overwhelm her without conscious effort, yet somehow felt protective rather than threatening, despite obvious capability for destruction that royal training would have developed. Around the hall, conversations erupted in whispered explosions as families struggled to process what they were witnessing, the disruption of carefully planned strategies through royal choice that defied every expectation about appropriate partnership selection, while pack historians frantically searched their memories for precedents that might explain behavior that violated established protocols or ceremonial proceedings. "Your Highness," Elder Blackwood approached with diplomatic urgency that attempted to balance respect for royal autonomy with concern about traditions that governed selection ceremonies according to principles that served both spiritual and practical purposes. "Perhaps there are protocol considerations that should be addressed before proceeding with choices that might affect ceremonial validity." Protocol considerations. Prince Kaelin's attention shifted briefly toward the elder, with expression that suggested amusement rather than concern about objections to royal behavior that transcended local authority to challenge or modify. "Are you suggesting that my choices require approval from those who lack authority to grant or withhold permission for royal decisions?" The question carried implications that made Elder Blackwood step backward, with recognition that he had overreached appropriate bounds in presuming to guide royal behavior according to local customs that might not apply to authority that operated beyond territorial limitations. "Of course not, Your Highness," he replied with careful deference, though his expression revealed ongoing concern about procedures that were being abandoned through royal choice to honor individual preference over established traditions. "I merely sought to ensure that all participants understand the significance of decisions being made during sacred ceremonies." "The significance," Prince Kaelin repeated with tone that suggested he found such concerns less compelling than Elder Blackwood appeared to believe they should be. "Tell me, what significance do you assign to divine guidance that operates according to principles beyond your understanding or control?" Divine guidance. The phrase transformed random royal choice into something that claimed spiritual authority for decisions that challenged conventional wisdom about appropriate partnership selection, suggesting that forces beyond social calculation had influenced behavior that appeared to violate established protocols. From her position beside him, Irina could feel warmth that radiated from his presence like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, could sense attention focused on her with intensity that made breathing difficult, while creating sensations of belonging that she had never experienced despite years of existing within pack social structures that had never quite accommodated someone in her circumstance. "Your Highness," she said quietly, her voice barely audible despite perfect acoustics that carried every word to ears that were straining to detect any indication about royal motivations for choices that would affect kingdom politics through partnership, decisions that transcended personal preference. "Are you certain about this?" There are many others here tonight whose qualifications exceed mine by any reasonable measurement. Qualifications. His golden eyes studied her face with attention that seemed designed to detect thoughts and emotions that she was trying to keep hidden beneath surface composure, that felt increasingly inadequate for circumstances that exceeded her preparation or experience. What qualifications do you believe matter for bonds that transcend social calculation to serve purposes deeper than political alliance formation? The question challenged assumptions that had governed her understanding of her own worth, suggesting that royal assessment operated according to criteria that had nothing to do with bloodlines or family connections, recognition that honored qualities their pack hierarchies had failed to recognize or properly value. "I have no family prominence to offer," she replied honestly, despite awareness that such admission might provide him with reasons to reconsider choices that had already attracted enough attention to become politically significant, regardless of personal motivations. No territorial influence that would strengthen kingdom relationships through strategic partnership. No family prominence, he mused, his hand moving to cover hers with touch that sent electricity through her nervous system, while his thumb traced patterns across skin that seemed hypersensitive to contact, that spoke of possession rather than casual affection. "Tell me, what do you know about the Silverwind bloodline?" The question struck her like physical blow, challenging assumptions about ancestry that she had never bothered to investigate beyond accepting pack assessments that dismissed her heritage as unremarkable background that carried no significance for social positioning or political consideration. "Nothing, Your Highness," she admitted quietly, though something in his tone suggested that her ignorance might be based on incomplete information, rather than accurate understanding of genealogical facts that could affect her value in ways she had never suspected. "The Silverwind line," he said with tone that carried weight of historical knowledge rather than casual observation, "includes connections to lunar bloodlines that predate our kingdom's founding. Ancestry that links to powers your pack historians have either forgotten or chosen to overlook during assessments that prioritized immediate political utility over deeper spiritual significance. Lunar bloodlines, ancient heritage that connected to forces governing the spiritual architecture of their entire world, genetic legacy that carried capabilities beyond normal shifter attributes to touch on powers that influenced natural cycles and divine recognition according to principles that transcended political calculation." Around the hall, murmurs of surprise suggested that pack historians were suddenly reconsidering records they had assumed to be complete genealogical documentation that might have overlooked connections possessing significance that exceeded local territorial concerns to influence kingdom-wide spiritual dynamics. "But more importantly," he continued, his proximity making her wolf stir with recognition that felt both foreign and somehow inevitable, "you possess qualities that my assessment has found worthy of attention, that operates beyond political consideration to honor character that reveals itself through behavior under pressure rather than display during comfortable circumstances. Character revealed through pressure. Years of enduring systematic invisibility without allowing it to destroy essential aspects of dignity and strength that had sustained her through circumstances that tested resilience beyond normal limits. Proof that worth existed independent of recognition or acknowledgement from those whose opinions had shaped pack social hierarchies. Your Highness?" Lady Seraphina approached with desperation that spoke of strategies crumbling under royal choice that defied every expectation about appropriate selection criteria. "Surely there are considerations about bloodline compatibility and political advantages that should influence decisions affecting kingdom succession and territorial relationships. Should there be?" Prince Kaelin's attention shifted toward her with courtesy that managed to be both polite and clearly dismissive, acknowledgement that her concerns were noted but found less compelling than she obviously hoped. "Tell me, what bloodline considerations take precedence over bonds that have been recognized through divine guidance rather than social calculation?" The challenge demanded justification for assumptions that had never been examined critically, exposing preferences that served political convenience rather than spiritual principles that supposedly governed ceremonial proceedings designed to honor divine will. "The ceremony," Elder Blackwood interjected with growing anxiety about procedures that had been disrupted beyond recognition, "traditionally concludes with formal announcements about bonds that will be blessed through official recognition and appropriate celebration." "Then let us proceed with such announcements," Prince Kaelin replied with finality, that suggested decisions had been reached that would prove irrevocable regardless of objections or concerns about traditional protocols. beginning with recognition of bonds that have been confirmed through methods that transcend your understanding but honor principles older than your ceremonies. He rose from his seat with movements that commanded attention from everyone present, extending his hand toward Irina with gesture that transformed invitation into honor, while his golden eyes held warmth that spoke of recognition rather than charity, acknowledgement rather than rescue. "Lady Irina Silverwind," he announced with voice that carried to every corner of the hall, "will you accept bonds that will elevate not just your personal circumstances, but understanding of worth throughout territories that have forgotten how to recognize value when it exists independent of conventional markers of success?" The choice being offered exceeded every dream she had ever dared nurture during years when hope had been the only comfort available to sustain her through systematic oversight. Transformation that would challenge everything she understood about her place in social hierarchies that had been revealed as inadequate for recognizing divine worth. But his hand remained extended between them, patient and warm, and offering possibilities that transcended fear to honor qualities that had been waiting years for appropriate recognition from someone wise enough to see beyond surface characteristics to underlying truth. "Yes," she whispered, placing her hand in his with movements that felt like claiming destiny rather than accepting charity, recognition rather than rescue. "Yes, Your Highness." When their skin touched, the hall filled with light that had nothing to do with crystal chandeliers, and everything to do with recognition that challenged assumptions about chance and choice in matters that governed divine will, bonds that had been waiting centuries for appropriate moment, to reveal connections that honored truth rather than convenience. The empty seat along the outer wall had become the most important position in the hall, proving that sometimes destiny waited not at the center where everyone expected to find it, but at the edges where those who understood their worth had learned to seek refuge until recognition finally arrived to honor what had always been there, waiting to be seen. The light that emanated from their joined hands was unlike anything the assembled pack had witnessed during generations of selection ceremonies, not the gentle glow that sometimes marked compatible partnerships, but something that seemed to pulse with ancient rhythms that predated their kingdom's founding, recognition that touched forces governing the spiritual architecture of their entire world. Ancient symbols appeared in the air around them, burning scripts that wrote themselves in languages older than written history, marking bonds that transcended ordinary ceremonial recognition to honor connections that had been waiting centuries for appropriate acknowledgement. The very foundations of the hall seemed to vibrate with resonance that reached into stone and timber that had never been designed to channel such profound energies. When the radiance finally subsided to levels that allowed normal vision to function, Irina found herself transformed, not in appearance, for her features remained unchanged, but in presence that now commanded attention through authority she had never possessed before. The simple dress that had been adequate, but unremarkable, now seemed to shimmer with significance, that had nothing to do with fabric quality, and everything to do with royal recognition, that elevated her beyond every limitation that had previously defined her social position. Around the hall, expressions of shock and dawning comprehension revealed the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Not casual royal choice, but divine recognition that challenged every assumption about worth and bloodline, about who deserved attention and who had been systematically overlooked, despite possessing value that transcended conventional understanding. "Behold," Prince Kalen announced, his voice carrying authority that made every wolf present instinctively acknowledge royal decree. "The bonds that divine will has chosen to honor through recognition that operates beyond your understanding of appropriate partnership selection." The formal declaration transformed private choice into public proclamation, elevating their connection beyond personal attraction to spiritual significance that would affect kingdom politics through partnership, that honored ancient bloodlines over contemporary social calculation. Lady Serafina, whose careful preparation had been designed to attract exactly this kind of royal attention, stood frozen with expressions that cycled between disbelief and dawning horror as she processed how thoroughly her strategies had been rendered irrelevant by choices that operated according to principles her advisors had never taught her to navigate or influence. "Your Highness," she managed to say, with voice that shook despite her attempts to maintain diplomatic composure, "surely there are considerations about the kingdom's welfare that should influence decisions affecting royal succession and territorial stability." The kingdom's welfare. Prince Kalen's attention shifted toward her, with interest that felt dangerous despite its superficial courtesy. Are you suggesting that divine guidance serves the kingdom less effectively than political calculation designed to advance specific family interests? The question exposed motivations that had been disguised as concern for greater good, but revealed themselves as advancement of personal advantage through strategic partnership that would elevate family prominence rather than serve spiritual principles that supposedly govern ceremonial proceedings. I merely sought to ensure that all factors receive appropriate consideration, Lady Seraphina replied with careful neutrality that attempted to balance acknowledgement of royal authority with preservation of family dignity in circumstances that threatened to expose their ambitions as less noble than they had presented them. All factors, he repeated, with tone that suggested amusement rather than concern about objections that lacked authority to influence royal decisions that transcended territorial politics to honor divine will. Tell me, which factors do you believe take precedence over bonds that have been confirmed through methods that operate beyond mortal understanding? Around the hall, pack members who had witnessed the supernatural display were beginning to understand that they had observed something far more significant than royal preference, recognition that touched forces governing their spiritual world, according to principles that challenged every assumption about power and its proper distribution. The ceremony, Elder Blackwood interjected with desperation that spoke of recognizing that their pack's reputation was being assessed along with their understanding of divine authority, has produced outcomes that exceed our experience with traditional ceremonial procedures. Perhaps royal guidance could help us understand appropriate responses to circumstances that challenge established protocols. Appropriate responses. Prince Kaelin's hand remained intertwined with Irina's, their connection radiating warmth that felt protective rather than possessive, despite obvious capability for overwhelming force that royal training would have developed. The appropriate response to divine recognition is acceptance and celebration, regardless of whether such recognition aligns with your personal preferences or political calculations. The instruction carried implications that effectively ended debate about the validity of choices that had been confirmed through supernatural demonstration, requiring acknowledgement that divine will operated according to principles beyond their ability to influence or modify through local customs or territorial traditions. Furthermore, he continued with tone that brooked no argument or appeal, those who question divine guidance reveal more about their own spiritual limitations than about the appropriateness of bonds that have been blessed through methods that transcend your understanding of ceremonial significance. From her position beside him, Irina could feel the weight of attention that had been focused on her existence for reasons she was only beginning to comprehend. Assessment that had apparently been occurring for longer than she had suspected, despite her careful invisibility and systematic efforts to avoid notice from those whose recognition might prove dangerous, rather than beneficial. "Your Highness," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent hall with clarity that suggested everyone present was straining to hear any indication about how someone in her position was processing elevation that exceeded every expectation about possible outcomes from ceremonial attendance. "I don't understand how you knew to find me here, how you recognized significance that I didn't know existed." "Divine guidance," he replied gently, his golden eyes studying her face with warmth that spoke of recognition rather than evaluation, acknowledgement rather than assessment of worth that might prove temporary or conditional. "Operates through methods that bypass conscious calculation to honor truth that reveals itself to those wise enough to recognize what others dismiss without proper consideration." "But surely," Lady Seraphina persisted with determination that exceeded wisdom, "there are practical considerations about royal partnerships that should influence decisions affecting kingdom governance and international relationships that depend on strategic alliance formation through appropriate marriage connections." Practical considerations. Prince Kaelin's smile carried implications that suggested he found such concerns less compelling than she obviously believed they should be. "Tell me, what practical advantages do you believe exceed bonds that have been confirmed through divine demonstration rather than political negotiation?" The systematic exposure of motivations was becoming more than simple diplomatic correction, evolving into comprehensive demonstration of how thoroughly their pack's understanding of ceremonial significance violated principles that should have governed communities claiming to serve divine purposes rather than personal advancement. "The kingdom," Elder Ravencrest interjected with growing anxiety about conversations that were revealing their local customs as inadequate for circumstances that demanded more sophisticated understanding of spiritual authority. has always benefited from royal partnerships that strengthen territorial relationships through carefully considered alliance formation. Has it? The challenge demanded examination of assumptions that had never been questioned critically, suggesting that royal assessment operated according to criteria that prioritized spiritual compatibility over political convenience in ways their territorial leadership had failed to recognize or properly value. Lady Irina's elevation, Prince Kaelin announced with finality, that suggested decisions had been reached that would reshape their understanding of worth and recognition, regardless of personal preferences or comfort levels, will serve as demonstration to territories throughout our kingdom about the difference between divine guidance and social calculation, between recognition that honors character and assessment that prioritizes surface characteristics. Recognition that honored character over surface characteristics. Years of enduring systematic invisibility that had failed to destroy essential qualities of dignity and strength. Proof that worth existed independent of acknowledgement from those whose limitations prevented them from seeing beyond conventional markers of success to underlying truth. The coronation, he continued with tone that carried weight of royal authority beyond appeal or modification, will take place within the fortnight, followed by celebrations that honor bonds confirmed through methods that challenge your understanding, but serve purposes deeper than political alliance formation. Coronation. The word struck the assembled pack like physical blow, suggesting transformation that exceeded simple partnership recognition to include elevation that would place her among the highest authorities in their known world. Position that would affect kingdom politics through influence that operated beyond local territorial concerns. Your Highness, Irina whispered, overwhelmed by implications that challenged every assumption she had made about her own limitations and future prospects. I'm not prepared for responsibilities that extend beyond anything I've ever imagined possible for someone in my circumstances. Preparation, he said softly, his thumb tracing patterns across her hand that seemed designed to provide reassurance, while his proximity made her wolf stir with recognition that felt both foreign and somehow inevitable, comes through experience rather than theoretical knowledge about positions that require wisdom earned through character development rather than inherited through bloodline advi. Intages. Around them, the ceremonial hall held its breath, as though even the ancient stones understood they were witnessing transformation that would affect more than individual circumstances, changes that would ripple throughout territories where royal authority established standards for community behavior and social recognition. Those who question divine wisdom, he announced with tone that carried implications about consequences for behavior that had violated sacred principles, will have opportunities to demonstrate their understanding of appropriate respect for bonds that transcend their ability to evaluate or approve. The instruction suggested that pack members who had dismissed her worth would face assessment that determined their own adequacy for continued positions within communities that served royal authority, evaluation that would measure their character against standards they had failed to apply appropriately during ceremonial proceedings. As royal guards moved to escort them from ceremonies that had been transformed beyond all recognition, Irina caught sight of faces that had ignored her existence for years, now watching her departure with expressions ranging from terror to desperate attempts at belated respect that suggested growing awareness of how dramatically power relationships had shifted. But rather than satisfaction at their obvious distress, she found herself feeling something closer to compassion for people who had been limited by assumptions that prevented them from recognizing worth until royal authority made such recognition unavoidable through demonstration that challenged their comfortable understanding of social hierarchies. Come, Prince Kaelin said gently, his hand guiding her toward exits that would take them from spaces designed for ceremonial proceedings to private chambers where their bond could develop, according to divine will, rather than public observation. There is much to discuss about inheritance you never knew existed, and responsibilities that will challenge every assumption our kingdom has made about Sao. Strength, worth, and the proper recognition of qualities that serve divine purposes. The Omega, who had chosen an empty seat along the margins, was leaving as royal consort, whose emergence would challenge every comfortable assumption about destiny and recognition, about who deserved elevation and who had been systematically overlooked, despite possessing value that transcended conventional understanding of worth and compatibility. Her transformation was complete, but the real changes were only beginning with kingdom that would learn the difference between ceremonies that served divine will an entertainment that violated sacred principles, between recognition that honored character and assessment that prioritized surface characteristics over underlying truth. The empty seat along the outer wall had become the most significant position in the hall, proving that sometimes the most profound discoveries occurred not at the center where everyone expected to find them, but at the edges where those who understood their worth had learned to seek refuge until recognition finally arrived to honor what had always been there, waiting for eyes wise enough to see beyond conventional expectations to divine truth that challenged everyone's assumptions about love, power, and the mysterious ways that destiny revealed itself to hearts brave enough to claim what had always belonged to them. Behind them, the grand hall fell silent, except for whispered prayers and desperate recalculations by people who were beginning to understand that their assumptions about natural order and appropriate recognition had been challenged by authority that would accept nothing less than complete transformation of attitudes that had been revealed as inadequate for communities claiming to serve higher purposes than personal comfort or social advancement. 6 months later, the coronation of Queen Irina had transformed the kingdom's understanding of divine recognition from theoretical concept into demonstrated reality, challenging every assumption about worth and bloodline that had governed territorial politics for generations. The ceremony itself had been attended by representatives from dozens of allied kingdoms, all gathering to witness the unprecedented elevation of someone who had been systematically overlooked until royal wisdom revealed value that local assessments had failed to recognize or properly honor. Now, as autumn painted the palace gardens in colors that seemed designed to celebrate transformation rather than mark seasonal change, Queen Irina stood on the balcony of the royal chambers that had become sanctuary rather than overwhelming responsibility, watching her former pack members work in the expanded service roles that had been created to accommodate their requests for opportunities to demonstrate reformed understanding of worth and recognition. Lady Serafina, whose ambitions had been redirected toward diplomatic service that utilized her family's political connections for kingdom benefit rather than personal advancement, moved through the gardens with dedication that spoke of genuine transformation rather than simple compliance with royal authority. Her work coordinating international trade relationships had proven valuable enough that her initial disappointment about ceremonial outcomes had evolved into satisfaction with contributions that served purposes greater than individual romantic fulfillment. Elder Blackwood, whose ceremonial duties now included oversight of reformed selection procedures that prioritize spiritual compatibility over political calculation, approached with reports that documented changes throughout territories where royal authority had established new standards for community behavior and social recognition. "Your Majesty," he said with respect that had been earned through months of learning to see beyond surface characteristics to underlying worth, "the harvest festivals throughout our territories are showing remarkable improvements in community cohesion and spiritual satisfaction among participants. Festivals that had been redesigned according to principles that honored contribution over bloodline, that valued character revealed through behavior rather than inherited advantages that required no personal effort to maintain, that recognized divine guidance in forms that challenged conventional expectations about appropriate leadership and social hierarchy. The new ceremonial protocols," he continued with something that might have been amazement, "are producing partnerships based on genuine compatibility rather than strategic alliance formation, bonds that appear to strengthen community welfare through cooperation rather than competition for social advancement. Protocols that had been developed from understanding that recognition operated according to divine principles rather than political convenience, that worth existed independent of acknowledgement from those whose limitations prevented them from seeing beyond conventional markers to spiritual truth that honored character over circumstance." "Any resistance to the changes?" she asked. Though 6 months of observation had suggested that most communities embraced reforms that prioritized genuine spiritual connection over the kind of systematic assessment that had nearly prevented her own recognition, despite possessing qualities that royal wisdom had found worthy of elevation to highest authority. Minor objections from territorial leaders whose own advancement had been based on systems that prioritized inherited privilege over personal merit, Elder Blackwood admitted, with the kind of diplomatic honesty that had characterized his service since learning to balance local concerns with royal principles that operated according to higher standards. But overall acceptance has exceeded projections for social transformation of this magnitude. From the gardens below, laughter drifted upward, not the careful sound of political gatherings where every expression carried calculated significance, but genuine pleasure that spoke of communities that had learned to value every member's contribution, rather than focusing exclusively on achievements that demonstrated conventional forms of success and social prominence. King Kaelin emerged from their private chambers to join her observation of afternoon activities that had become routine, rather than noteworthy demonstrations of reformed social dynamics, his presence still radiating authority that commanded respect, while offering protection and partnership that had challenged her understanding of her own capabilities and potential for contributions that extended far beyond anything her previous circumstances had suggested might be possible. The delegation from the Eastern Territories is requesting formal guidance about implementing similar reforms throughout their alliance networks, he informed her, settling beside her with movements that spoke of comfort and familiarity that had developed through months of learning to navigate shared responsibilities and complementary strengths. They want to establish ceremonial procedures that honor spiritual recognition over political calculation. The Eastern Territories represented nearly 100 individual pacts spread across vast geographical areas. Their adoption of reformed social models would affect hundreds of thousands of lives, while demonstrating that transformation could occur through voluntary recognition, rather than requiring the kind of dramatic intervention that had been necessary to reveal her own worth to communities that he had been too limited to see what royal wisdom had recognized immediately. Schedule comprehensive consultations for next month, she decided, already considering how to adapt their successful methods for communities with different cultural backgrounds and varying levels of commitment to traditional hierarchical structures that might resist changes requiring acknowledgement that worth existed in forms they had been trained to dismiss. Include representatives from territories that have already completed successful transitions. Let them hear first-hand accounts of improved outcomes, rather than theoretical projections about potential benefits. As evening settled over the palace grounds, bringing traditional closing ceremonies that honored both individual achievement and collective progress, Queen Irina found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from empty seat along ceremonial margins to partnership with the most powerful authority in their known world. The transformation had required courage beyond simple acceptance of recognition, had demanded growth into responsibilities that challenged every assumption she'd made about her own limitations, while revealing capabilities that had been waiting years for appropriate circumstances to manifest in service of purposes greater than personal comfort or individual advancement. But perhaps most importantly, her elevation had proven that worth couldn't be determined by surface characteristics or family connections. That strength often existed in forms that challenged conventional expectations about appropriate leadership, that divine recognition operated according to principles deeper than social calculation, to honor qualities that served spiritual purposes rather than political convenience. The empty seat that had once represented resignation had become the foundation for authority that would reshape their kingdom's understanding of recognition and worth for generations to come, proof that sometimes the most profound destinies waited not at the center where everyone expected to find them, but at the edges where those who understood their value had learned to seek refuge until wisdom finally arrived to honor what had always been present, waiting to be seen by hearts brave enough to look beyond comfortable assumptions to divine truth. Throughout the territories that stretched beyond the horizon, communities continued to discover what became possible when they learned to recognize worth that existed independent of conventional markers, when ceremonies honored spiritual connection rather than political alliance, when divine guidance was allowed to operate according to principles that challenged everyone's assumptions about who deserved recognition, and who had been systematically overlooked despite possessing value that transcended ordinary understanding. The kingdom had learned that sometimes the most important revelations occurred not through dramatic announcements, but through quiet recognition of truth that had always existed beneath surface appearances, waiting for wisdom sufficient to see beyond limitation to possibility, beyond dismissal to acknowledgement, beyond emptiness to divine purpose that honored what others had failed to value. Apropos, riotly, Queen Irina had chosen an empty seat, and destiny had chosen to sit beside her. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.